Hello, Rune Scholar, wherever and whenever you are. I'm the modern Erilar. Today, let's talk about the women who came before us who also read and wrote in runes. I'll present this story through multiple types of evidence: gendered terminology from Old English, references to feminine literacy in surviving poems and sagas, archaeological evidence that indicates women were regularly part of the social context for the usage of runes, and runic inscriptions that were received or carved by women. Let's consider each in turn. Runic terminology found in two Old English manuscript sources gives us our first and probably earliest connection between women and runes. The Épinal and Erfurt Glossaries are separate copies of a single Latin to Old English edition, probably composed in Canterbury during the late 7th century and containing about 3,300 words, about a third of which have Old English translations or glosses. It survives in copies now at Épinal and Erfurt, with partial copies surviving in several additional manuscripts. In the section on Latin words that begin with the letter P, the word for the three fates, parkas, is translated to burgrune. Burg means a mountain or a high place, so the burgrune would have been women skilled in mysteries associated with a high place. This aligns with Tacitus's account of the Germanic seeress Veleda, who prophesied from a high tower. It also aligns with the Gesta Hervardi, where a Norman magical practitioner used a wooden tower erected in the swamps outside Ely to strengthen the Norman attack with her magic. It also aligns with the Nordic practice of Seidr, where a magical practitioner usually sits on a dais as she practices divination. The Old English word leodrune appears in this prescription in the mid-10th century manuscript Bald's Leechbook, and it means one skilled in tribal cult practice, and possibly specifically a sung mystery. Now, whether the rune suffix in burgrune and leodrune specifically indicates a literate tradition is still speculative, but the persons associated with the mysteries themselves were definitely gendered female. So let's get a bit more concrete. Poetic and saga evidence gives us clearer indications that women were both able to read and to write in runes, and that this may even have been relatively normal. In episode 6, I mentioned a 10th century Anglo-Saxon poem called The Husband's Message. Its last sentence encodes a message in runes, creating a riddle where the names of the runes are the solution. So the wife would have needed at least that much literacy for the message to have been successful. In some of the sagas, we can even see indications that women's literacy was not considered exceptional, at least around the time that the poems were recorded. The Eddic poem Atlamál in Grönländska tells of the journey of brothers Gunnar and Högni to the court of their sister Gudrun and her husband King Atli. Gudrun sends a runic message to warn Högni of an impending attack. An enemy of the recipient, Vingi, changed the runes while the message was in transit, such that the message urged Högni to visit Gudrun, rather than warn him to stay away. But the poet tells us that Högni's wife Kostbera hunni honskil runa, she had a discerning knowledge of runes, and she works out the deception. In the poem, she says, "One thing I am most surprised by, I still cannot work it out, how it came about that a wise one should go astray in writing, for it seems to make known that it would cause the deaths of both of you if you raced off there. The woman is lacking a letter, or this is the doing of others. The women in the poem, Kostbera and Gudrun, were depicted as more literate in runes and as using writing for more positive purposes, while the men in the poem either defaced the writing or were unable to decipher it. In Grettis saga, a man named Hallmund recounts his adventures to his daughter, telling her, "What I tell you of my adventure I will tell in verse, and you shall cut it in runes on a staff." Later in the same saga, another old woman cuts runes into a large stump as a means of cursing Grettir with an injury. Thorgerd Egil's daughter, the daughter of Egil Skallagrimsson and his wife Asgerd, appears in several sagas, but in Egil saga Skallagrimssonar, as her father grieves her brother Bodvar, she asks Egil to compose a poem in Bodvar's memory, which she will carve on a rune stick, and she uses this as a way for him to recover from his grief. In Bósa saga, an old woman named Búzla visits King Hring and compels him through magic to release her foster son Bósi and Hring's son Heraud from imprisonment. Her magic is conveyed in a series of verses referred to as Búzla's prayer, where she poses a riddle to the king, saying, "Here come 6 men. Tell me all their names unbound. I will show you." She then presents 36 runes in a particular order, which you can see here in surviving manuscript examples, and King Hring is unable to solve the riddle. We as rune scholars, following the example of Michael Schulte, can recognize words like tistel for thistle, mistel for mistletoe, and kistel for chest. Rune writers employed these exact words in this same encoded fashion in several magical incantations that survive across Scandinavia, so Búzla is clearly an advanced user of runes. And we have further references to women in connection with runes in even more sagas. We know from archaeological evidence that women were an intimate and important part of the societal context for runic writing. In Anglo-Saxon England, runes appeared on swords, high-status brooches, bracteates, and gaming pieces, a mix of objects that does not point to any specific traditional gender assignment, so there was no close correlation between a specific gender and the presence of runic texts, which might indicate that runes may have been dominated, for example, just by men. The Oseberg ship burial of 2 women contained 3 different objects with runes: a bucket, a sledge or a sleigh, and an oar. More broadly across the rune-using world, runes appeared on a larger proportion of female-gendered dress items than those gendered male. Svante Fischer concluded that the distribution of male personal names on objects traditionally gendered female indicated that runic literacy must have been an overreaching discourse that included both genders, though he also points out that in patriarchal societies, women are often taught literacy because of their rank and status within the patriarchy. And our early evidence for women in connection with runes does indicate that the women associated with runes tended also to be wealthy. The gold pendant bracteates that give their name to one of the earliest periods of runic practice, between the 5th and the 7th centuries of the Common Era, were typically used and worn specifically by high-status women, and these bracteates often featured runic texts. According to Elin Anderson, if we look at inscriptions that record that person 1 did something for person 2, like Sinke Sven polished for Thorfrider, where we can assign a gender to the name, women are mentioned as owners 33% of the time, whereas men were recorded as owners only 13% of the time. Finally, the inscriptions themselves tell us that women read, raised, and wrote runes. The simplest way to identify women in inscriptions is to search for women's names, whether through simple textual presence or explicit authorship. While female names in runic texts were less common than male names, the very personal nature of many messages strongly implies that women were the recipients of written runes, which tells us that they probably would have been able to read them. A man familiar enough with the poetry of the Carmina Burana manuscript carved lines from poem 88, stanzas 4 and 9, and poem 71 here in Latin, but he has summarized the phrases and transliterated them into runes. We believe a man sent this message to a woman because the lines quoted from the Carmina Burana are also a man speaking to a woman. Egil Kragerund has analyzed the text, and this translation follows Kragerud. Our rune writer here has summarized the verses for his own use, and the second verse that Kragerud interprets here is an assurance that the writer will not transgress the ethical boundaries of courteous behavior to cause her sorrow and spoil their relationship. Very poetic. We see two different hands carve messages on this same rib bone, but addressed to two different named women. He who carved these runes loves you, Tordis, is on the side shown here, and a second carver wrote on the other side, Tora, I know how to make love. Okay, and from Lom, Norway, a proposal message. Havardr sends a name that starts with GU, probably Guthni or something along those lines, sends Guthni his friendship and God's greeting. And now it is my full desire to ask for you in marriage if you do not want to be with Kolbein. Think over your intentions and have me told your desire. This message dropped between the floorboards of the church, so we do not know the outcome of this particular message. Women also sent messages, even if we cannot prove that all female senders carved the runes themselves, but more on that in a minute. In this very well-known inscription that I mentioned in episode 19, Geetha has sent a very clear message to tell someone to go home, possibly answered on another side in a very unintelligible set of runes in a different hand. We do not know whether the message was written by Geetha herself or by someone who acted as her messenger, but she very clearly caused a message in runes to be sent on her behalf. And we have similar actions on more permanent media. During the Viking Age, many women appeared on runestones. According to Birgit Sawyer, 12% of all runestones were sponsored by women on their own, and a further 15% were sponsored by women together with men. Women were commemorated on a little less than 8% of the total runestones in Scandinavia. However, there were definitely regional variations because women were mentioned in 39% of the runestones in Uppland, one of the most prolific regions for the practice of raising runestones. In this inscription, Gunvor Tidriker's daughter made a bridge in memory of Astridr, her daughter, and Gunvor also tells us that Astridr was the handiest maiden in Hadeland. So not only is this an example of a woman on her own commemorating another woman, that commemorated woman is being praised for skills that are not just keeping a household. An interesting window into how women of the time thought about how to praise other women, and at least had runes raised on their behalf. But we do have many examples where women are quite likely to have, or definitely did, write in runes themselves. And they tell us that in their own hand. The first known female runic authors appear in the late 6th century, when we know of at least 4 signatures by women. One of these was Blythgunth, who signed this portion of a 6th century wooden weaving loom recovered from a woman's grave. And she tells us Blythgunth wrote the runes. We might expect to see women's names associated with textile tools, as the sagas describe many women spinning and weaving, but we have examples of other crafts and professions as well. Another maker's name appears on a bone plate from Derby, which reads, "May God save the Hada who wrote this." The serifs on this Anglo-Saxon piece are lovely, as is the bind rune with which Hada has inscribed her name. You can't see from this photograph, but Laura Guerra indicates that there are 2 small holes on the right side of the plate, such that you could pass a ribbon through them. So this may have been a bookmark, a ruler, or a tool for turning pages in a manuscript. At Maes Howe, inscription OR Barnes 24 reads, "Jerusalem travelers broke into Orkhauger," Orkhauger meaning the chamber grave of Maes Howe itself. It is then signed by Cleef, the Earl's housekeeper, and Leaf is a woman's name, she defines herself according to her profession, rather than describing herself as someone's wife or someone's daughter. This particular inscription is less formulaic than others inside Maes Howe, many of which only named carvers without providing additional details. So Cleef demonstrates for us a more impressive active literacy with her composition and her ability to write. While it is impossible to give really firm statistics on the extent of runic literacy according to gender, women definitely could and did use runes to express themselves. We have them connected to runes in terminology, in literary references, in the archaeological context for runes, and in the inscriptions themselves. So, thank you for reading the runes with me, the modern Erilar.